Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for day number 2 of my Worlds 2023 Swiss stage coverage. Very excited to get into this. Of course, it's going to be pretty similar to yesterday. We're still in the best of 1 stage. We don't kick off best of 3s until tomorrow, and so still just kind of, chugging along. Not exactly the most do-or-die games of all time, but you certainly don't want to put yourself in a position today where you're ending up 0-2, or if you're 1-0 right now, you don't want to fall to 1-1. You want to put yourself in the best possible position. So every game's still mattering a lot, and while the draw might not have been the most interesting in the entire world, I think some of the games definitely shape out to be at the least very interesting in terms of the gameplay. But let me know what you guys were excited for, what you thought of today's games, what you thought was going to happen. Did it live up to your expectations? Did you think some teams that lost were going to win? I'd love to know you guys' thoughts and feedback on everything you were predicting to happen down in the comments section below. Of course, if you do find yourself enjoying the video at any point, it really would mean a lot if you leave a like. I'm not asking you to do it now, but if you find yourself in 5 or 10 minutes being like, wow, I really like the coverage this guy's doing, leave a like, hit subscribe. It really does help the channel out, but I don't want to pander to you guys too much. I want to jump right into the analysis. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game through all 8 of the games that happened here on day number 2, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team had. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each game that happened today, and at the end of the day, we're going to preview everything that you can expect from day number 3 in these games, and so kind of a comprehensive overview of everything happening at Worlds right now. But without further ado, let's jump into it. Day number 2, like we talked about and like you can see up on your screen now, is definitely a little bit frustrating in terms of the draw that we got. 5 of the 8 games on day number 2 are inter-regional matchups, but I guess this is kind of what you can expect when you have a Swiss format, and a lot of the regions are better than the other regions, right? When you have a lot of the LPL and LCK teams in upper bracket, when you have a lot of the LEC and LCS teams in lower bracket, you're kind of bound to have a few matchups that are just those regions facing off against each other. That being said, this was like statistically super improbable to be able to get this layout, to get 5 of the 8 games being inter-regional. It is what it is. Hopefully it means that we don't get a ton of these matchups moving into the future weeks because of their records being a little different. But, as far as I'm aware, I think they confirmed this on, I think Shox actually confirmed this on Twitter yesterday. These guys can rematch if we do get further along in the tournament. So just something to keep in mind. I think that's an oversight as a rule and not necessarily what they might have intended with the Swiss format, but as I digress, moving on to kind of the game structures. Obviously, if you're 1-0 right now, if you're in that upper bracket, things aren't nearly as dire. You've put yourself in a much better position moving into today so that you can maybe get one of these better teams and feel a little bit better about potentially getting a bad draw in this stage because you have that, safety net, but you don't really have that if you're 0-1. Remember, 3 wins and you're into the next round, 3 losses and you are eliminated from the tournament. And so if you lose your first 2 games, you are now on elimination's door going into the best of 3 stage, and that's just not where you want to be. So big games for everybody. Of course, if you go 2-0, then you're only 1 game or 1 series away from qualifying for the quarterfinals, which is pretty massive. But we're going to go ahead and find out which teams are going to end up where by the end of today's video, and we get to kick it off with our first series of the day, and this is a North American matchup as we had the number 1 seed from the LCS in LNG taking on the number 3 seed from the LCS in Team Liquid, and LNG is going to be able to pick up the win here. This is what I predicted. I think a lot of people were going in favor of Team Liquid after what they had shown, at least in the previous day's game against T1. I see T1 pretty highly, at least in comparison to maybe some of the other analysts. I think that they're a team that is probably going to ramp up as this tournament goes along, and while they do have their weaknesses and some players that might not be performing at the highest of levels, I think that their really good players are still world-class, and I expect them to be able to perform as such. And Team Liquid really should have won that game. They ended up throwing it away late, but LNG did not have that same kind of day 1. They kind of got trounced by Weibo. Really was not a competitive game, and that's kind of what we expected. Weibo's one of those incredibly talented teams that just does really well against teams that aren't as talented as they are, which is the case for LNG, and, I guess theoretically they could have shit the bed, which they do sometimes, but they didn't. So both of these teams kind of coming opposite ways into 0-1, but I still predicted LNG to be able to take this game because Team Liquid, all that they proved to me in that game is they still don't know how to close out games. They might be able to get early leads, but they don't know what to do with them once they are able to get them, and You know, Energy is one of those teams that I think is very clinical, and I think definitely doesn't get enough credit for how good their macro is in the mid to late game, and I just thought they'd be able to outpace them. And while Energy did win, I think my analysis on why they would end up winning wasn't exactly entirely correct. They just dominated this game in the early game and ended up snowballing it completely out of control, and that's really not what they drafted for. I think when you look at the two drafts from each side, it is exactly kind of playing into the ideology that both of these teams represent. Red side for Team Liquid is a lot of really good lane matchups. It's the Syndra into Orianna, which has been super successful over the course of this tournament. It's the Kalista early on, trying to really assert lane dominance as quickly as possible. It's things like the Cassante that really don't have bad lane matchups at the current moment. Red side wants to be able to win isolated in their lanes, and they want to be able to hit that mid-game power spike where they're going to be relatively good. This team doesn't get worse as the game goes on, but they do lose the scaling battle in this, because when you look at Energy's comp, they are full scaling. They have basically no one that can create any sort of pressure in the early game. You drafted a lane of, you drafted Jax, you drafted Ori, and you drafted Senna. You're not supposed to be doing all that much in the early game. Basically, all of these are scaling lanes that aren't going to be able to win 1v1 unless there's a massive player diff. And unfortunately for Team Liquid, there was a pretty massive player diff in this game. We can talk about multiple roles, but player of the game for me is going to go to Palafox. I think it was very much a toss-up between Palafox and Contract, so I think both played really well in this game, but Palafox, I think, just absolutely stepped back up. He had a pretty rough game number one into Weibo. I don't think he looked particularly good, especially considering the fact that Xiaohu hyped him up so much in the Worlds process, talking about the scrim results, saying that Palafox was a bit of a genius. Obviously, I agree. I think Palafox is awesome, specifically as an NA mid laner. I think, he's fantastic, and, it's cool to see two NA mid laners face off against each other for the first time, I believe, since Season 1 Worlds, which is really, really cool, but Palafox was just better in this game. He got a solo kill on the Syndra at level 3, which is just impossible if Syndra's not completely running it down. We'll talk about APA in a second. He had one of the worst games that I've seen, probably the worst game at this tournament in the main stage so far, but Palafox was really good. A lot of that was the pressure that he was able to put on as a player. Orianna is a pick that I've been much lower on, I think, than consensus. I think B1 Orianna is just way too exploitable. We've seen the Syndra or the Azir or things like that really just be super consistent as an answer to Ori. And I don't think she's a bad pick. I certainly don't think that there are situations where she's ever going to be completely negative, but you're not really asking for a lot of early game pressure coming out of the middle part of your map by picking her, especially on B1. Unless you just outplay your opponent, like Palafox did. I think this is one of the exceptions to the rules. It's not going to change my mind about the pick. It was just a really good game from Palafaker. And then Contracts in the jungle, he really abused the Syndra just as much as the Orianna did. Contracts has been awesome on Sedge, on Maokai, on these more engaged style tank champions in the jungle. Not necessarily the things that you would typically associate with Contracts' playstyle because of how aggressive and how risky he is as a player, somebody who is more than willing to trade 1-for-1 in a lot of these early and mid-game skirmishes. But he's super okay with doing that specifically on these engaged tanks because really that's kind of their job. I do think it's kind of a really nice stylistic matchup. The player, and I'm not saying he's on the same level as this player, I compare him to kind of like a budget Tarzan. I think he's very similar in terms of how he plays the game, the champions that he excels at, and kind of the mentality that he goes into a lot of these engages with. And I think we saw that in this game on the Sedge, where he really was creating a lot of panic early on. This is not a Sejuani game where he should be able to, control the tempo, and he did anyways. I think Contracts and Palafox were great. FBI and Ignar pulling out the Senna and the Tahm Kench. Really, really fun to see that. I don't love it from a viewer standpoint because I think it's quite a boring bot lane, but it's really strong, and I think it is really good to see the innovation, to see that there are teams that are going to be trying to adapt to that. I do think that Senna Tahm Kench is something that is very playable in the meta right now because of how strong scaling is just in general. If you can get to that late game, Senna is just as good as almost any other AD carry in terms of the utility and the damage that she ends up offering, and specifically with Tahm Kench, it makes her lane phase so safe and it makes it so easy to get to the part of the game where Senna is really strong. We've seen it work really well in the past. I believe it is just as strong as it has been in the past right now. Dplus going for Jax. This is much better in terms of playstyle than the Ornn yesterday, even if I did like it isolated into the matchup with the Rumble. I don't love Jax into Cassante. I know I really don't like anything into Cassante. I think he really is just that strong right now, but Dplus is good enough on Jax to be able to make it work, and clearly if the rest of the map is just going to win, if jungle mid are just going to do this well, it's going to be pretty easy to win no matter what. And then for Liquid, you drop to 0-2. This is kind of what I expected. I really didn't think this team was going to be able to perform super well at Worlds. They were the last ranked team for me in terms of the major regions. I had them coming in at number 16 in my primer power rankings, and these are the kinds of games why. It's just they don't really seem to know how to execute their win conditions nearly as well as a lot of other teams. They don't really have focus. I'm not going to say they're poorly coached because I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but it really just feels like 5 solo queue players trying to come together, with the exception of Pioshik and APA, who are typically playing off of each other really well. The problem is APA just had the worst game of his professional career. There really is no other way for me to put this. APA has been awesome ever since his call-up to Team Liquid mid-season. He was awesome in Academy as well when he finally got that promotion at the beginning of 2023. However, it was bound to happen eventually. He had a real stinker, and unfortunately was on the world stage. I do think a bit of it is going to be nerves. I also think APA's playstyle does lend himself more to, once he is super far behind, he doesn't exactly take his foot off the gas, and so sometimes it can just kind of spiral out of control, which, you know, I think ended up happening this game, but this was really bad. He got a really good matchup, getting the Syndra into the Orianna, which we've seen basically every mid laner dominate on over the course of this tournament. Up to this point, it's just been a super positive matchup for the Syndra. And he got solo killed at, you know, level 3 and just never was able to survive the rest of the game. And so it's unfortunate, but I'm not going to sit here and ridicule him and dog on him too much. Everybody's allowed one bad game when you are super new to League. Remember, this guy's been playing at the top level for like half a split. And so for him to even show up at Worlds, he had a great game 1 going into Faker. He looked awesome in that lane. He played really well in the team fights. He almost won them that game on the Syndra pick. It was just a bad game. It happens every once in a while, but it's worth noting. Not like anybody else played well. Summit kind of got trounced in this game, playing a really strong champion in Cassante. Typically, his advantage over everybody is how good he is in the laning phase, but he didn't even win there. Core was basically useless on the rel pick that he's become very famous for domestically. Yon picking up this Kalista, something that TL has very often wanted to go for as a team, basically, over the last 3 or so years, right? No matter who's been in that AD carry spot. I get that they want that early lane pressure, but you know, if you lose early, then you're just kind of doomed. And then the Viego, Pioshik was still really good in this game. He was awesome, obviously, in that game. Number 1 was probably the best player in the T1 TL game, but he was still fine in this one, still tried to create some pressure. It's just every single one of his lanes lost. There's really not a lot you can do as Viego in those circumstances. And so definitely a disappointing game for Team Liquid. You wanted to see a little bit more, but it's not particularly surprising to me that they ended up losing this. They are now 1 game away, 1 best of 3 away from being eliminated from Worlds, which is definitely disappointing, but I can't say I'm entirely too surprised. And then for Energy, this is a nice win. They're the number 1 seed from the LCS. They should be winning games like this domestically. They're now sitting at 1-1. This is a pretty good spot. There are a lot of, you know, avenues for them to still be able to put themselves in a relatively decent position to get to 2-1, or maybe even to get to that 3rd win and get out of groups. It's not entirely impossible for this team. I just don't know if a win like this gives me the most confidence that that's definitely going to happen, but at the very least, it's a step in the right direction. And then moving on to our second game of the day, and this one I also find to be relatively interesting. We're going to the upper bracket now, but we're sticking with a North American team as we have the number 2 seed from NA in Cloud9 taking on the number 3 seed from the LPL in LNG Esports. And pretty predictably, once again, LNG is going to be able to take this one. This is not a surprising outcome for either of these teams. I think LNG is one of the best teams in the entire world right now. And while I do like Cloud9, and I do think that they have a lot of things going for them, they just are not on the level of a team like LNG, one of the top, undisputably, 5 teams in the world right now, in my opinion. I just don't think there is any configuration of teams that you could have in your top 5 that doesn't include LNG in one way or another. They're that good, and I think they ended up proving that once again here. They're a team that has just been so consistent ever since they started figuring out what they needed to do with Gala in the lineup, because they've been putting him on weak side, which is a pretty crazy thing to say for a player like Gala, but it's really strengthened the rest of what LNG has wanted to do. They've played for Zika, and specifically, obviously, they played for Scout a lot over the course of the last few months, but Gala is such a good weak side player, and he's so strong in the isolated 2v2 if you just give him that lane to really worry about and not think about the rest, that it honestly doesn't matter. And I like this draft a lot from LNG. I think it's a really interesting combination of pieces. I don't think Cloud9's is bad by any stretch. I think they went for some pretty safe picks, some picks that I think are relatively good, you know, in the meta right now. I just think that LNG's is pretty exceptional, and I think that it ended up getting them a much better result. Let's quickly talk about the draft. The reason I like LNG's a lot more is because I think that you just have so many more options both early and late. Really, the only time of the game that I would be worried about is if you were going relatively neutral into some of these mid-game skirmishes around Rift Herald. That's where I think champions like Renekton, champions like Syndra could really start taking over in those specific circumstances, and especially if you get Kai'Sa online in one of those fights, all of a sudden the game does become a little bit more difficult, but LNG controlled a lot of the laning phases because they picked a couple of really good matchups. I've been talking about this the entire process, but Jax into Renekton is now very Jax favored, even early on, because of the magic resist nerfs. that Renekton got in the patch that we're on Worlds, and, you know, I think that's really big for just how the meta has shaken up, and I think Jax in general has risen in popularity a lot because of that, and Zika took advantage of that really well in this game, and also, I love R5 Tristana in this game. I think it actually opens up a lot of different options for what LNG wants to do. Gala has been more than willing to pick up a lot of these AD carries that other people are just not playing. Even just like bot laners, I should say, because it was Ziggs a lot in the LPL that he was really going towards. He was really the only player in the LPL playing AP bot laners, which is cool, but you know, things like Tristana here as well. Gala is not afraid to take these champions that might be really strong in other roles and try them out in the bot lane, and Trist definitely counts for that. And Trist is really good into Kai'Sa because of the early pressure that she can apply, specifically with that Alistar in the laning phase. And so, I really like the draft. Really, the only thing that you're concerned about is potentially the Syndra getting strong early, because Azir does take a little bit longer to ramp up than someone like Syndra does. I know that a lot of people are complaining about Syndra because they watched the first 2 games of today and saw 2 Syndras play pretty badly. But, I mean, come on. Like, clearly, anybody who has watched more than literally only the 2 games today would know that Syndra has been phenomenal at this World Championships. And, you know, go look at the post-match thread for this. This is the reason you can't trust Reddit in terms of analysis, is because half the comments on Reddit are like, why is anybody even picking Syndra? I mean, it's incredibly short-sighted, but I've complained about the LoL community enough. Syndra's a really strong pick, and I do think that it's really good in this matchup. Eminence is just not as good as Scout, and that really was the difference maker here, but Scout is just exceptional. There really is nothing else I can say. He's going to get another player of the game here. He got, I think, approximately 14 million of these in the LPL over the course of this year. It just felt like he was consistently getting them every single game. He's been the best player in the world in terms of production this year, and it's carried over into Worlds so far. I know they haven't exactly played the toughest teams. They played Fnatic, and they played Cloud9, which aren't exactly, you know, dominant Eastern teams that, you know, have lined up to really, you know, be able to contest what Scout was doing in the regular season, but Scout has been that guy all year long. Even in the playoffs, he's been really good for this team. He was a big reason, probably the biggest reason why they made finals in the summer split, and like I said, it's carried over into summer. He's played 2 games, and he's dominated both of them on Azir, and it's just really impressive stuff. If Scout can keep this up, LNG has the case to be made to be a top 2 team in the entire world right now. But I also think Tarzan is another player who really stepped up and played really, really well in this game. Lee Sin was struggling a lot in the play-ins, and it's really good to see that you give Lee Sin to better players, players that can more accurately do stuff in the early game with that champion and aren't going to be as, you know, hesitant to make some of these more aggressive plays. And, oh, all of a sudden Lee Sin does look like one of the better junglers in the meta at the moment. I like to see that. I was concerned about this pick and about how it kind of translated because I like Lee Sin, and I actually think he's pretty good in the meta for creating advantages right now, but it just wasn't working out. It's good to see that that has kind of changed, but Tarzan is very much back in form. He got back in form in the playoffs. He was phenomenal in their playoff run, and I know a lot of people were still down on him because of the regular season because, you know, the LPL fans specifically have to pick one player that they just hate for basically no reason. For most of this year, it was Karsa. I'm not going to say no reason on Karsa because he had bad games, but they just overly hate. A lot of this year, it was Rookie on top esports, and then eventually, when they got bored of that, they transitioned it into being Tarzan. Tarzan was fine for most of this year. He had a couple of bad games, but everybody has a couple of bad games. If you're going to say someone is washed for playing bad in 2 games in the LPL, then I don't know what to tell you. Our analysis is just not going to match, but Tarzan's been fine most of this year, and he was awesome in the playoff run. All the people saying he's getting back into form at Worlds just didn't watch those games. I really don't know what else to tell you. He's been in form for a little while now, and he's continued that into Worlds. Like I said, Gala offers so much for this team in terms of playing weak side, but Hong is a big part of that as well. Zika is really on the up and up. He really kind of exploded in the spring split and has kind of carried that momentum into the rest of the year. In general, LNG is just kind of clicking. They really haven't faced a lot of resistance. Not that they played great teams, but it's just been 2 solid wins as a team that's really good. And then for Cloud9 on the other side of the map, I don't like their idea behind how to play this game out. I really don't like playing for Renekton early on in this game. I think that that is a major mistake in terms of game plan from them. I think it is pretty clear that you have to play for bot side here, either to get Kai'Sa ahead in some of these mid-game skirmishes like I was talking about, or just like super going in on that Syndra lane. I understand Eminence didn't play particularly well, and we'll get to that. The solo laners were definitely the problem this game for Cloud9, and Eminence in general has just not been a strength for this team internationally, but at least you're on a winning matchup. Like, that's really your matchup that you should be prioritizing. Just felt like Cloud9 had a really bad read of how to play out this draft. And that's definitely a little bit frustrating because, like I said, they spent a lot of time top lane trying to get Fudge in a good position. And Jax is just better into Renekton now. And I don't really know what else to say to that. I guess the idea of, oh, maybe, you know, Renekton is a strong early game champion and Jax is a strong late game champion. That must mean Renekton wins. It's really not that simple anymore, and it just didn't feel like Cloud9 understood that. Fudge is going to get my dead of the game because he got a lot of these resources and he did approximately nothing with them. He struggled a lot internationally, and, you know, he did take a step back in summer, in my opinion. He was awesome in spring. He was my MVP runner-up in the spring split in the LCS, but summer was not nearly as explosive from him, and it does seem that that has carried over into Worlds at least a little bit. He was okay in game number 1, but he was pretty bad in game number 2 here against what I think a lot of people would consider the weakest lane of LNG in the top lane, and then Eminence also struggled just individually. This is a matchup that Syndra should win, but he was nowhere to be found on the map. He was missing team fights, he was missing skill shots. Just a bad game from Eminence. Like, the individual performances from him have been really lackluster, especially recently. I still really think highly of Blabber and Berserker. They're the reason that I have so much confidence in this team, but you put Blabber on Sejuani, where he's not really going to be able to play super aggro in the early game against Lee Sin, and he's going to kind of have to rely on his laners surviving, and you put Berserker on Kai'Sa, you know, going into something like Tristana, where he does have to kind of seed lane pressure early, and you're not really asking for a good position to be in if you're Cloud9. It's just actively playing out of your strengths, which I think is just a bad idea. And even, you know, if you're going to play this draft, at least identify where you can play through early on, and they just weren't able to do that. It's definitely frustrating, but a lot of it is mental for me. These are mental mistakes from a team that has shown quite a few mental mistakes over the course of this year, so Cloud9 being the team that we kind of expected. I didn't think they would beat LNG, but I was kind of hoping that they would at least try to play something interesting. It just felt like they didn't show up today. They didn't have a good game plan, and they didn't execute on it well. And then for LNG on the other side, this is a nice win. Again, they really haven't been tested. Now they're 2-0, though. They are going to be tested in the next round, whether they want to be or not. I think they've set themselves up nicely, and I do trust this team, but it's going to be interesting to see what happens when they face a team that isn't quite as maybe easy to beat as Cloud9 and Fnatic have been. And then moving on to game number 3 here, and I think there's going to be a particular narrative that kind of surrounds this game that I don't know is entirely justified. I might be pushing back on it a little bit. It's the number 3 seed, I believe, from the LEC in Mad Lions, taking on the number 4 seed from the LEC in Team BDS, and Mad is going to pick up the win here, and I know a lot of people are frustrated by this result because Mad showed absolutely nothing on day 1. They got absolutely destroyed by Cloud9. It wasn't a particularly close matchup, and I think European fans in general just have this kind of unnatural disdain towards Mad Lions as an organization. They've had it for a couple of years now. They just hate them. I shouldn't say hate. I don't think that that's necessarily accurate. They don't trust Mad. And while I do kind of understand the general idea of where that comes from, because this is an org that now twice has failed to get out of the play-in stage at Worlds, they have failed to really do much internationally except for the year 2021, which everybody just like conveniently ignores. Everyone just conveniently ignores them getting into the semifinals at MSI and them getting into the quarterfinals at Worlds in 2021, but it's fine. I understand, you know, there's not a ton of players on that team that are still here. It's just Elyoya and Karzi that are left from that roster, but Mad showed a lot of good things over the course of this year, at least domestically, and, you know, they're an interesting team. Now, a lot of people have certainly turned on them, generally speaking, because, like I said, LEC fans in particular have very little patience for Mad. They're not going to look at a loss that Mad has and say, well, you know, they were good the last couple of games, and so we should give them a little bit of leeway in this one. They're immediately going to jump to, Mad sucks, I hate this team, you know, why are they even going international? They're a disgrace to EU. It's just kind of how the conversation typically ends up going, but I'm going to drop some little tidbits in this, and I apologize if it's a hot take, if I make LEC fans mad. Certainly wouldn't be the first time on this channel, but if you're a diehard LEC fan and you don't want to hear it, you probably just want to skip the analysis of this game. A lot of people are talking about how crazy it is that Mad was able to pick up the win here and about how big of a deal it is that Mad suddenly turns into like this ridiculously good team when they play other EU teams, but they can't handle international play. And unfortunately, what I believe to be the truth of it, and what I talked about in my primer, what I've talked about all year long, is just that outside of G2, Europe's not very good. Like, EU's just not very good this year, and that's okay. You're allowed to have bad years every once in a while, but it's not just this idea that Mad all of a sudden gets a lot better when they face other EU teams. It's just that other EU teams are easy to beat. Like, they're a lot easier to beat than the other teams that they're going up against. BDS is not Cloud9. Like, I hate to say that, they're just not. And I'm not trying to sit here and say that NA is better. I think Cloud9's the best NA team, and You know, I do think Team Liquid is likely worse than both of the teams that are in this game. I think Energy is probably on the same level as both of the teams that are in this game. That's not my point. I'm not trying to sit here as an NA fanboy. What I'm trying to say is I think LEC fans have kind of tricked themselves into believing that, you know, the region is still where it was in 2019, in 2018, in 2020, where you had 3-4 teams that could genuinely compete to get out of the group stage at Worlds. It's just not the case anymore. G2 is legit, but the reason I had them ranked so low in my primer, the reason I had them at number 9 and not higher is because I legit verbatim said, I don't know how good G2 is because they've been playing against bots all year long. Like, I just don't have a lot of confidence in the rest of the region, and I think this series kind of sums that up. I think Mad is better than a lot of the European teams, and I think that should go to show you just where kind of the middle tier of EU is at the current moment. Hopefully they can get better next year, but these teams just aren't particularly good. This game was fine. Mad Lions was proactive, but it wasn't a particularly dominating win that really changed my mind on these teams. And you know, again, if you're an LEC fan that disagrees with me, I'd love to have a conversation with you about it in the comments, as long as it's respectful and not just saying that I'm a moron for having this take. I do think there is reason to believe that potentially there is, you know, some gameplay differences. I think obviously banning out all 3 of Adam's champions makes BDS a worse team because nobody else on this roster outside of Nuke has been able to win at all this tournament, but you know, it just is what it is, right? Like, BDS nor Mad are top, you know, 12, 11 teams at this tournament. It's just really not where they're at, but let's talk about it. Draft, starting with, I guess, I know that's a little bit of a tangent. That's a 4-minute tangent out of the way, but Draft was interesting. It certainly has some interesting takeaways. I like the idea of banning out Darius, Olaf, and Garen from Adam. I think that if BDS has proven anything over the course of this tournament, it's that Adam is really good on those champions, and Adam can absolutely dominate basically anybody on those champs, even if they're one of the best top laners in the world. He's just that good on those champions, and so getting him off of those and getting him onto something a little bit more meta that isn't exactly like a god's pick, like Renekton, I think is definitely a positive, and more than that, like taking away Adam's ability to dominate lane and for them to be able to play through him exclusively is really bad for BDS, because this bot lane has been a huge negative, and so Matt identified that, and they wanted to go for a comp that was a little bit more, I guess, universal. I love the Lissandra pick. I think that that is incredibly strong here. I'm very confused about the Azir on R5. I think Azir is really bad into Lissandra. I think that's a very Lissandra-favored lane, and I don't really understand the idea of it. It's not that Lissandra doesn't scale well either. I don't really know the part of the game that Azir is just better than Lissandra in, especially after the early game nerfs that Azir received, and so I get that Nuke's really good at the champ. Not really sure I would have gone for that in this department, and Lissandra was very useful, but Nuke was the best player on BDS in this game, and so who am I to end up bringing up anything? I think everybody on Mad just kind of did their job in this one. Player of the game for me is going to go to Elyoya. In the jungle, it felt like his pressure early on this Bel'Veth was very important. We know that Bel'Veth has kind of been one of the staple junglers in the LEC over the course of this year. The LEC in particular, especially in comparison to the other 3 major regions, have had their own kind of unique picks. They bring out a lot of the Lissandras, a lot of the Cassiopeias. You know, we've seen Adam bring out a lot of the champions that he's super comfortable on. Things like the Kog'Maw and the Braum have been more common in the LEC. Gragas has been more common in the LEC than it has in other regions. Bel'Veth definitely fits that narrative as well, where the LEC is very happy to pick up something like Bel'Veth. A lot of the teams at this tournament from Europe are willing to pick up Bel'Veth, and Elyoya is definitely a Bel'Veth player, as we saw in the playoffs, and he did that again here. This was a really solid game from him. I know the scoreline doesn't necessarily indicate that he dominated, but the pressure that he was able to create was really, really strong. I do think this was a bit more of a team effort than one individual player playing at a crazy high level, but Elyoya played great. I think Hylissang also played really well on the Rel. He was kind of trash on day number 1, and that's Hilly. Like, he's going to have good games and he's going to have bad games, but it's good to see that the good games are going to be able to show up against some of the weaker teams here at Worlds. Hylissang was a lot more proactive, and I think a lot of the engages very much did end up landing and putting his team in a good spot. Like I said, Lissandra was really big for this comp in terms of being able to shut down some of the more proactive plays that BDS could actually make. You want to identify a target that Lissandra could, you know, just kind of shut down and make sure they don't have an easy time in the game. That's really, really nice to be able to do, and I think Niski being able to pull out that champ is a positive. Chasey looked really good, much better in this game than he has in recent months. He was miserable in the season finals for Mad Lions, and he was bad on day number 1. Good to see him have a good game here against BDS, and Carzzy was solid on the Xayah. He's been pretty consistent, so overall, just a nice win for Mad. Nothing like too extraordinary. They didn't really do anything that I think was exceptional. They were just kind of the better team. And then for BDS on the other side, they're just whatever, right? Like, I know people are really excited about BDS, but I was low on this team for a reason, and it's because, first of all, the bot lane has just been bad at this tournament. You take away the ability for this team to play through top lane, and you take away the ability for them to win through the top side of the map, and you kind of rely on Crowny to win a bit more. it's just not happening at this tournament. I'm not going to say that Crownie's a bad player because he was really good for most of this year, but the last month and a half for Crownie has been really bad. He's been a bottom 380 carry at this tournament, including the play-in teams. Like, he has just not been able to do anything, even against worse teams than what Mad Lions are. Crownie is just not having a good tournament. He's not in good form. I don't really know what to tell you. If he's not going to be able to carry, you have to get Adam on one of those champions that he can win on early, or else it's just completely doomed, and we kind of saw that. Sheo had his first real bad game of the tournament. He's been very consistent, but he hasn't exactly been a game changer for this team, just someone who is making good plays and allowing the rest of his team to make great plays, and that's fine. You can definitely win with a jungler like that, but a couple of really bad engages coming out from the Vi, some really ill-timed ones that I think really cost BDS quite a bit. Nuke was the saving grace for BDS. He actually played this game really well, and he's been really good over the course of this tournament. Again, I feel pretty confident that Nuke is going to be relatively fine in most of the matchups that BDS ends up having, but they're now 0-2, and so their backs are really up against the wall. There's really not a lot that they're going to be able to do if they get an unfavorable draw. There's going to be, at the very least, one really strong team in the 0-2 bracket with a couple of really strong teams playing off against each other in the 0-1 side of the bracket today, and BDS could very well draw one of those teams, and if they do, I mean, they might just be out of luck, right? It might be that unfortunate, but this is a team that I think a lot of people have been saying might not have even been the best team in play-ins, with PSG just kind of collapsing and ego drafting the second half of their series. And, I think they end up performing like that. I think Adam has started to, kind of return back down to earth, playing more normal champions, and the bot lane has still continued to struggle. And Sheo and Nuke aren't really kind of game-changing players. And so a team like Mad can step up and win this game. It doesn't change my opinion of Mad really at all. I predicted them to win this game, which I know maybe surprised some people, but I thought they were the better team, and they turned out to be the better team. They had a much more coherent draft that I think gave them more options basically everywhere except the mid game, and I think they executed on it well. This is a nice team performance, but it's not a performance that gives me the confidence that Mad is just going to completely be able to turn their international fortunes around. And now reaching the middle of the day here, moving into game number 4. This was one that I think I wasn't particularly interested in terms of matchups, but was a much more interesting game than I think a lot of us expected. It was the number 2 seed from the LEC in Fnatic taking on the number 1 seed from the VCS in GAM Esports, and Fnatic is going to be able to pick up the win, as they absolutely should in this game, but there were moments in the mid game where it was looking a little bit more interesting. That being said, that's kind of what you would expect from these two drafts. I think GAM spikes really hard in the mid game, especially once Kai'Sa starts to get to second item. It all of a sudden becomes a completely different game to end up playing if you are Fnatic. However, skill level was just a little bit too big of a gap in this one. And I know I've said that a couple of times over the course of this day already, but I've said it 1,000 times on this channel over the course of this year. You're probably tired of hearing it if you were a longtime viewer of the channel, but draft is super important. Draft can give you a big edge, or it can make it a lot more difficult to win the game, but no game, in my opinion, I mean, I shouldn't say no game, but most games aren't won in draft or lost in draft. If you are the better team, if you have a significantly worse draft, you're probably still going to win that game. Really, League of Legends at its core is a game about being able to play to your win condition better. Which team plays to their team's win condition and is able to identify and capitalize on that win condition more efficiently and better, because every team has some form of win condition. Every team has some champion that if they get fed will just win the game for them, and that's just kind of how League is structured. That's how League is as a game, and so while you can give yourself big advantages, it's not always quite that simple. And that being said, I don't even think Fnatic drafted poorly in this game. I think they definitely gave themselves a lot of avenues, specifically in the early game, to be interesting in this one. So let's go ahead and talk about it. As for draft, I really like the bot side of the map for Fnatic. I think that you're actually in a really good spot. Being able to play through this Azir into Jace lane, which I think is probably the best lane into Jace. I think Jace is basically unstoppable in terms of the early game and the mid lane at the current moment. It's the reason that I've called him the best mid laner in the game right now, but Azir's the one champion that I think not only survives early against him, but is going to be a little bit more relevant in the isolated 1v1 because of his safety and because of his ability to just, scale up super duper quickly. He's just going to be so much more useful in the late game. And then Xayah Nautilus is just going to be stronger than Kai'Sa Rakan in the early game. So you do give yourself options if you're Fnatic, but what you're worried about is playing out this mid game where Jace starts to spike, where Kai'Sa starts to get to an item and a half, where Sejuani and Rakan can be these big playmakers when you're starting to get to these Rift Herald fights or potentially second or third Dragon. These fights are going to be a little bit more topsy-turvy topsy-turvy than maybe you would expect to see at that point in the game, and that's where Fnatic really did, start to lose some control of the game. Not that they were ever really in trouble, but where GAM, Kati in particular, really started to make some interesting plays, but Fnatic just ended up outskilling them in all of the fights that really mattered, and they ended up closing it out. Player of the game for me is pretty obviously going to go to Humanoid in the mid lane. Really nice to see him start to get to Worlds Humanoid kind of form, if you will. The 2022 World Championships were very much defined by Humanoid for a little bit, specifically the play-in stage that he dominated, and he was really good in Group A as well, but he hasn't quite been as strong at this year's Worlds. I say that they've only played 2 games. It's not like there's been this giant sample size. He wasn't particularly great in their first series, or their first game against LNG, but he was going against Scout, so you're willing to let that pass a little bit. Now he's going against Kati, who did play well. Humanoid just played better, and that's really nice to see. Humanoid's a player that I think has pretty consistently leveled up when games matter. I've complained about him a ridiculous amount in the regular season over the course of not only this year, but last year as well, where it just feels like sometimes he takes games off, and he plays with his brain off. He pushes up when he doesn't have prio, when he gets caught out like that. I've said this like 1,000 times, that level 3 to level 5 gank on mid lane was like so automatic for any team playing into Humanoid over the course of the regular season, but those are the kinds of things that he has basically always cleaned up, both in playoffs and at the World Championship. So it's good to see that that has continued. Again, Azir is just a really strong pick in the meta right now. Good to see him continue to function really, really well. And then Noah and Trimby, I think, also played well. Trimby maybe less so, not that Trimby had a bad game, but Noah made a lot of really good plays. Crazy what an EU AD carry can do when they're not on Ezreal, huh? The Xayah was very useful. He basically only used ultimate super aggressively in this game, which is always a really fun, way to play Xayah. I think Xayah is really good right now, probably the AD carry that you will want to ban the most. I know Kai'Sa is maybe a little bit stronger in terms of raw power, but Xayah is really good into Kai'Sa, which is why, to me, Xayah is kind of a must-ban as a champion at the current moment to make, team comps a little bit more diverse if you're on red side, but I digress. It just kind of is what it is. They wanted to take the Kai'Sa into Xayah matchup, and Xayah continues to show that that is very Xayah-favored. Trimby was fine on the Nautilus, but it really was Noah and Humanoid that were kind of the main carries. Oscar was much more solid in this game. Renekton is one of those picks that really has not been all that impressive, but obviously still does the things that Renekton does. I don't love the matchup into Cassante, mostly, again, because I love Cassante, and I just think he wins every lane, basically, on default, but, when you have Rel kind of assisting you in that circumstance, and when your team has so much prio in the early game, it becomes a lot easier. Humanoid and Noah definitely the standouts, though. And then for GAM on the other side, they're just not good enough to be able to go up against a team like Fnatic. They are a major region team after all, even if I do think that EU is weaker than, the LCK and the LPL. I think that the VCS has gotten super far in this tournament, maybe farther than you would have anticipated. This was an okay performance from them. Katsi in particular, I think, played really well. Pallet had a couple of good moments. Those are the two players that I think stood out as having interesting moments. I mean, KIA was solid enough on the Cassante. There's only so much you can't do on that champion, but Levy and Slater, I think, really struggled and have really been struggling against good competition, even in the play-in stage. This was not exactly a strength for these two players in particular. Levy is going to get my dud of the game on the Sejuani. He just has not been the player that you would remember if you thought back to 2018 or something for Gigabyte Marines back in the day. It's just not the same jungler. He's been very not proactive, not only at this tournament, but even domestically. He really was not a superstar jungler in the VCS either. He's just a fine player now. He's probably the weak link of this team, and then Slater kind of reverted back to some of the mistakes that he was having domestically and also at the beginning of this tournament when they were going up against Loud. The first time where he's just way overextended, doesn't really have a ton of vision to back up his positioning and his playstyle, and ends up getting punished pretty hard for it in this game, specifically towards the back half. The Kai'Sa, like I said, was in a pretty decent position to actually deal a lot of damage in the mid game because this team does spike relatively hard in that part of the game, but Slater's positioning and his just lack of ability to play safe really cost them, I think, in a lot of some of these more pivotal situations. And so those two players definitely not stepping up, but those are the two players that haven't really been stepping up over the course of this tournament, if we're being entirely honest. GAM didn't really play any different than they had been playing all tournament up until this point. I think Fnatic was just in a position to be able to kind of exploit them for that, so they dropped to 0-2 again, not surprising. They're happy to have made the Swiss stage at all. They're happy to be in this stage of the tournament. I don't think they expected a ton of wins here. And then for Fnatic, this is a nice win. It's a very expected win. They drew a very good draw, getting GAM in the second round here. They're going to go to 1-1, but I still am concerned about this team. They did look good in this game, but they're really not the most clinical team at this tournament by any stretch of the imagination. Their macro is still relatively poor in the mid game, and I like Razork a lot more on these more active, more damage-oriented type picks rather than the Rel. I think that he's a little bit more passive, ironically enough, on champions like Rel than he is on the Talia, which of course was banned out in this game, or even the Ivern, which has become a pretty big pick for Fnatic over the course of the last few months. But, you know, I still think Fnatic is fine. Humanoid is starting to get into form, and if Noah can play at a high level, that's what kind of got them here in the first place. I just don't know if I'm completely convinced that they're going to be a top 10 team at this tournament, but for now, like, this is a nice win and one that they're going to be happy to get against GAM. But now moving on to game number 5, and this is certainly an intriguing one in the upper bracket. It's a rematch of the LCK finals, both in spring and in summer. The two teams that have really kind of dominated their way through the LCK this year. It's a matchup between the number 1 seed from the LCK in Gen.G and the number 2 seed from the LCK in T1. And Gen.G is once again going to get the job done. The fact that they can win with this draft, I think, is very telling that Gen.G is just simply the best team in Korea at the current moment. I don't even think it's really all that up for debate anymore. They have won everything. They have beaten T1 twice in the finals, first in spring, then in summer. Yes, they lost to them at MSI, but we're going to ignore that. That was when T1 was still the stronger team of the two. And then going into the summer split playoffs, you know, I predicted Gen.G to be able to take the LCK title. Everybody was telling me I was crazy because I had Gen.G and T1 in the finals in my predictions. Obviously, that looks pretty good now. You know, Gen.G being able to win that wasn't particularly surprising, and the confidence clearly that they have gained from being able to take down T1 so many times over the course of this year is drafting Kha'Zix Akali as their mid-jungle duo in a 1-0 game against T1 in Korea at Worlds, and winning on it, which is just absurd. I mean, it's a fantastic game coming in from Gen.G. You just have to be proud of these players for what they're actually able to accomplish, but there are some things that I will say I could see being in T1's favor in this game, at least, you know, some positives to take away. Faker was phenomenal, but let's quickly go over draft and why I think this is just so odd. First of all, Kha'Zix Akali is just the most risky mid-jungle duo you could possibly go for. This is such a risky draft in general. Coming out from Gen.G in this game, you really need to just outskill your opponent, and luckily for them, they did, but it's not like they performed particularly well in the early game when they needed to. I think the top side of the map is actually in trouble here, if I had to guess. I don't love some of these matchups. I think Aatrox is phenomenal in Rumble, but we will get into why that didn't exactly matter, especially as the game ended up going on. I think, you know, for as much shit as I give Orianna being a late-game scaling champion that doesn't really have a ton of, I guess, versatility and tempo-setting abilities in the early game, Akali is certainly one of the lanes that I think Orianna does well into, and I think B4 Akali is certainly bold coming out from Chovy in this game. And so when you're looking at topside, you see the Aatrox, you see the Ori, you see the Jarvan in particular that really facilitates a lot of what they're going to be doing. They should have the advantage of being able to play around the top side of the map, being able to control when the Rift Heralds are taken, etc. in the early game, and they did try to play for that, and Gen.G rightfully realized that that wasn't going to be a strength of their game. However, when you do look at kind of the 3v3 potentially in the bot lane of Xayah, Rakan, and Kha'Zix versus Jarvan, Kai'Sa, and Alistar, Xayah, Rakan are going to be stronger in that matchup, and especially with adding Kha'Zix into there, you can do some damage in the bot lane if you're Gen.G, and I think they identified that. They knew they wanted to play around Pays and Delight for most of this game, but the problem for T1 is the fact that, yes, they, I guess, identified that Faker needed to be strong this game and that Zeus was going to be in a relatively positive position, but Owner played really bad. Like, he was just really, really awful in terms of pathing, in terms of playmaking and creation this game, and even just in terms of being in the right place at the right time, being around his Fed members and making sure that they could win them the game. It wasn't happening, and that was a big problem. For Gen.G, you know, Peanut was really lax in the early game. He didn't try to do too much, which I understand with this comp is maybe the right thing to do. You scale pretty hard, especially if you do end up getting online eventually. Rumble and Xayah are just generally going to be really big teamfight threats, and if you add in Kha'Zix and Akali potentially taking care of the Kai'Sa on the backside, it does make the teamfighting a lot more difficult for T1. So I do, you know, kind of understand the idea behind the scaling here for Gen.G and behind Peanut playing like super inactive at the beginning part of this game, but it's not like Peanut really pressured Owner all that much. Owner just made a lot of really bad plays and really bad decisions as he went throughout this game, but player of the game pretty easily has to go to Delight. It's just unfair that he continues to get, you know, these engaged champions. It was Alistar in game number 1 when they decimated GAM. It's Rakan here in game number 2, the two best engagers, in my opinion, in the game at the current moment. Delight has very much solidified himself as a complete star for this Gen.G team. It feels like he has gotten better over the course of this year, which I'm really happy to see. That's the kind of development you want to see from a player that was brought in without really having a ton of success in the LCK on a team like Brion before he was able to join Gen.G. Obviously, they saw the upside, they saw the promise, they wanted to pair him him with a really young bot laner in Paze, and it very much has worked out. Delayed has been a superstar so far in their 2 games at Worlds, and that very much continued with this Rakan game. Paze was really solid on the Xayah. It's crazy how strong this champion is. I really do believe that if you're on red side, it's becoming a must ban. Like, it really is becoming something that you just do not want to allow. We've been seeing the Poppy and the Maokai kind of be the priority bans coming in on red side, but I think Xayah absolutely needs to be on that list, if not above both of those picks, because I really do think Xayah changes the game significantly more. She's just good into every other AD carry in the meta. It's not that her individual strength is that much stronger than everybody else's, it's her matchup in particular against every other meta AD carry. It's just really, really good, and, you know, especially if you give that to someone like Paze, and if you give over Xayah Rakan, if, you know, Gen.G was very willing, they took the gamble, they're like, we'll take the Xayah, we know you're gonna, you know, take the Rakan away, and you're not gonna give us both, and T1 said, no, we are gonna give you both, we're gonna take the Ori and the Kai'Sa instead, and they're like, okay, I guess we win the game, and that's kind of how it is. Xayah Rakan is basically unstoppable as a duo right now, and so very, very strong with how they performed. Like I said, Chovy and Doran were also good. Doran won a top lane matchup that isn't particularly Rumble favored. A lot of that is because Zeus ended up going lethality Aatrox. I guess he didn't read the patch notes, and he didn't realize that that just doesn't work anymore. They completely destroyed the interaction on purpose because they didn't like how it worked for Aatrox as a champion. Zeus clearly just doesn't read the patch notes. Like, there's no other excuse, because he should know. Like, it's not like, oh, this is just a personal preference thing. They literally got rid of it from the game, and so frustrating there, but Doran absolutely took advantage of that. He got a solo kill later in the game on Gumayushi, which was fun, and like I said, Peanut was a little bit lagging behind in terms of the pressure, and, you know, Kha'Zix in general is just not a pick that I particularly love, but at least it offered something, and I think pairing it up with the Akali certainly made T1 question whether they wanted to go for some macro plays in the mid game. And so Gen.G definitely had their strengths, but most of it was through their bot lane, and then for T1, Faker was phenomenal. He was so mega fed in this game. It's actually insane that they found a way to end up losing this because Orianna got so strong. I like the matchup. I like Ori into Akali. I don't think Akali was a very good pick this game, and I specifically like it because of the Jarvan, because Jarvan is one of the champions that does actually do really well into Akali. He has multiple ways to get on top of her, and if he baits out her abilities early on in a fight, he actually has ways to trap her. He has enough tools in his toolkit to actually be able to punish a lot of Akali's mistakes, especially with an Orianna on top of him and making sure that he has an even extra layer of CC. But the problem was that Owner just like AFK'd. He's easily dead of the game. I don't know what was happening here. Faker was mega fed, and then Jarvan just completely forgot about her, and then Faker's getting 3-man dove, and her Jarvan is absolutely nowhere to be seen to try to protect her. If I was Faker, I'd be so ridiculously tilted because Faker played so well in this game, and Owner just completely left him out to dry. He has been miserable ever since Faker took that time off. There really is no other way to say it. Like, he has been a bottom, 2 jungler in the LCK ever since Faker took that time off, even though everybody else seems to have rebounded and recovered since Faker has gotten back into the team. Owner has not. He is playing absolutely awfully, and this is the kind of downward trajectory that is incredibly concerning for the outlook of Owner moving forward. If he's going to be this player, T1 is not going to be a World's Finals team, which I think is the expectation for, the roster that has been constructed and has stuck together for the last couple of years. But like I said, Zeus was also awful. Building lethality on Aatrox doesn't work. Picking Aatrox, which is just this super hard counter to Rumble, and losing lane is just really bad. It's just not a good look. Guma and Keria were kind of put in a rough position this game. I'm not going to blame them all that much, although Guma getting solo killed under his own tower by the Rumble is certainly not a good indicator of where their mental state is at the current moment. T1 just didn't play well in this game. I don't know if that's going to be sustainable over the course of the rest of this tournament, but this was not good. Gen.G clearly has their number, and they did it once again. They destroyed him once again, and Gen.G looks really good. I got some pushback for having them at number 2 in my power rankings going into the tournament. I'm not entirely sure that that's going to turn out to be correct because of just how good teams like LNG and BLG have shown themselves to be, but until proven otherwise, Gen.G, all they have done is decimate 2 teams at this tournament so far. They've decimated GAM, and they destroyed T1 in this game, and so they look really, really good. Paze and Delight in particular are definitely stepping up in their first time at Worlds, and the top side of the map I think has been really solid as well. Gen.G looks really, really solid, and you gotta hope they're gonna be able to continue that. And now jumping into our 6th game of the day, and this is personally the one that I was the most looking forward to here on day number 2. I think this is probably the most evenly matched kind of matchup between 2 teams that we haven't already seen. Of course, there's some finals rematches, there's some big names going up against each other, but this is 2 teams that I think are relatively right next to each other in terms of the power rankings, for me at least, going head to head. It's a battle between the number 1 seed from the LEC in G2 Esports and the number 4 seed from the LPL in Weibo Gaming. And in a super back and forth, very fun, very tightly contested matchup, G2 just barely, so narrowly is able to come out on top with the win. What a game from both of these teams. You got to give both of them a lot of credit because while there were some mistakes from both of these teams as things went on, specifically in the back half of the game from Weibo, both of them tried so hard to show why they deserve to be considered top 8 teams. And honestly, with the way the DK is playing right now, yeah, I think both of them are top 8 teams at this tournament. Very, very convincingly. Very fun stuff. Weibo had this game in the palm of their hands, and then G2 strikes back from beyond. Weibo makes some critical errors down the stretch, and G2 is able to capitalize and end the game to pick up their second win of the tournament and to go to 2-0, which is massive for them. I think that their schedule has been very fun. They played the other 2 teams that I put in B tier alongside them, and they've beaten both of them, which is super impressive, and I'm super proud of this team. For Weibo, it's a pretty crushing loss. You certainly didn't want to lose this game considering where you were at, considering you are kind of the scaling team. I say that. Both of these teams scale ridiculously, right? Neither of these teams are early game teams, but you know, Weibo had a lead, and they had a team that should be able to finish off a game with a lead, and they're just not able to get it done. There's a lot to be proud of, but man, a lot to be proud of from G2 as well. So let's go ahead and talk about it. This draft is pretty interesting. Both teams, like I said, going for pretty similar playstyles. I think both of them are definitely a lot more late game focused. They're definitely a lot more focused on trying to get to a part of the game where they can team fight. I think lanes are relatively even, in my opinion, with the exception of top lane, which I think is pretty in favor of Weibo Gaming. I think Asante actually does really well into Yone. I know you guys are probably really annoyed with me talking about how good I think Asante is, but it's just what I believe. I think the champion is really good in basically every lane matchup, especially when you pair him up with something like Vi that can be active on that side of the map. I can see a circumstance in which you try to take a lot of 3v3s against Yone, Rel, and Orianna, and you just win them super hard because you just have more damage and you have more survivability, you have more playmaking options earlier on in the game. And to be fair, early in the game, that's exactly what happened. The Shy was able to generate a ton of gold, a pretty big lead in the top lane. He was leading the game in gold for a majority of this game on the Cassante, and that should be kind of the direct happening of this draft. That is exactly what I would expect to happen when this draft ends up finishing, but it is good to see because the Shy has been a little bit topsy-turvy, a little bit more up and down as a player. It's good to see him have a really good performance here. It wasn't perfect the entirety of the game. He made a couple of pivotal errors down the stretch that ended up costing them, but his lane opponent, who ended up losing early, was actually in a relatively precarious predicament and spot. Yone was not strong going into the late game. Yone was not, you know, in a position where he was going to be able to take over a lot of these team fights. However, Broken Blade's awesome, man. I mean, I have bought into Broken Blade all year long, and this is the fruit of that labor. He was spectacular in this game. Easy choice for player of the game for me. That final Yone ultimate was, I mean, just chef's kiss. It was so good, and Broken Blade has really, like, secretly been the carry for this team. I know Mickey X kind of gets a lot of credit, and Hans gets a lot of the resources, but Broken Blade has very secretly been, like, the guy for G2 Esports over the course of this year. A lot of their important games in the finals, in the season finals, in, you know, the playoffs, at MSI, like, it was Broken Blade stepping up and being that guy. It's the reason I ranked him so highly in terms of my top lane rankings above the Shy coming into this tournament, is because I really believe in Broken Blade a lot, and he did nothing but prove me right in this game. It's crazy to think that I'm high on him now as a player, considering what I was, you know, talking about him like in 2020 or 2021, but you know, you have to change your opinion with the tape that ends up matching. I'm not going to sit here and stick to my guns and say Broken Blade's an awful player when his tape and his form has been awesome over the course of the last few years. And so G2 has unlocked a new form of him, and he was great in this game. Mickey was also spectacular on the Rakan. You gotta give a ton of credit to Yike as well. For somebody who has no Worlds experience and, you know, is a rookie on a team that has ridiculous expectations, he's been unbelievable. Like, he has been so good at this tournament. He just out-jungled Canyon in game number 1, and he was a big pivotal factor in these team fights for why G2 ended up winning the game here in game number 2. Just awesome stuff. Hans was really good. Caps was really solid on the Orianna. Everybody on G2 played their part. Their team fighting towards the back half of the game was definitely exceptional, but Broken Blade, to me, is definitely your standout member. And then for Weibo on the other side. You had so many good moments. The Shy looked so good in this game until he didn't. Light looked so good in this game until he didn't. Zhao, who was doing a ton of damage, and the rest of the team couldn't actually help answer it. It's super unfortunate because I think you had so many opportunities to end this game, to win. But, I mean, this is what a banger at Worlds looks like. This is what a 300 gold deficit by the end of the game, by the taking of the Nexus, looks like. Is both of these teams performing at a high level. I look at Weibo very positively. I do have to give dud of the game to somebody, so it's going to Crisp, and I don't even think Crisp played bad at all. I think Crisp individually was pretty useful, but Leona as a champion just doesn't really do all that much, specifically when you're hitting the later parts of this game where everybody else, look at these team comps, everybody in the game is so strong when you hit 3 items that Leona just becomes significantly less useful as this game goes along, because there really aren't a lot of avenues for her to be able to go in and survive and actually be able to consistently CC chain the enemy team so long as they are, you know, playing well. And that ended up being the case. Crisp really couldn't do anything down the back half. Again, there were some other misplays. You know, Weiwei made a couple of misplays on the Vi. The Shy made a couple of misplays on the Cassante. Light made a couple of misplays on the Kaisa. But they all had points in this game where it felt like they were incredibly strong and doing incredibly well. And I just never got the same feeling from Crisp on the Leona. But in general, both of these teams, I think, come out of this game looking really good. I don't think you can look at either of these teams and say, like, oh, you know, Weibo lost this, so they must not be very good. Or, oh, G2, you know, it took them a really long time and they narrowly, you know, lost this game. They barely beat Weibo, so they must not be very good. I think both of these teams are very, very good, and I think both should be proud of this effort. It's going to be interesting. G2's now in that 2-0 bracket. This is very, very intriguing. A lot of people expected them to get out of this main stage, but they have the potential to get out of it 3-0, which would just be insane. They now get a best of 3 tomorrow to determine if they can do that. They're going to face a top tier team, but they've done nothing but impress at this tournament up until this point. And then for Weibo, they go down to 1-1, but you do not want to draw Weibo in the 1-1 side of the bracket. This team is scary, they are dangerous, they are talented, and they are motivated. At the current moment, I expect this team to do fine. I think both of these teams are going to do well, even more so as the tournament continues to move on. And then moving on to game number 7 here, and this is another one that I think a lot of people were looking forward to. We talked about the LCK final rematch that we had earlier on in the day between Gen.G and T1, so now it's time for the LPL teams to follow suit. Not quite a summer finals rematch, but the top 2 teams from the LPL facing off against each other as we had the number 1 seed from the LPL in JD Gaming taking on the number 2 seed in Bilibili Gaming. So another inter-regional rivalry, got a ton of those today, and just like as it has happened all 7 times before, JD Gaming is going to pick up another win against BLG. This team went, and I'm not joking, 15-1 in the regular season in the LPL, with that one loss being to JDG. They just cannot overcome this demon, and I don't know what else to tell you. If you predicted BLG in this game, I don't know. They have some sort of mental block against this team that they are not able to overcome. They've been playing really well, although, like I said in my primer, they're not exactly playing in the best form that they have all year. They lost to LNG in the playoffs. They didn't exactly look great in that series either. It looked like they rebounded relatively well on day number 1 against KT Rolster, but JDG's a completely different beast. This is the best team in the world right now, and one of the best teams of all time. You have to be on your A game to be able to beat JDG, and they just weren't able to do that here today. As for the drafts between these two teams, I think they're relatively similar, if we're being entirely honest. I don't think there's really that massive of a difference. I find some of these picks to be really interesting. First off, On going towards the Blitzcrank, it's something he's really dominated on domestically at the LPL level. It was a big reason why, for most people, including myself, he was the best support in China this year, and that was certainly not anticipated. He was really good on playmakers like Blitzcrank. Obviously, he can play a lot more than that. The Nautilus and the Rakan are all really good, but the Blitz is really the thing that I think has caught a lot of people's eye, and so to pull that out on the side of BLG is great. To R5, Aatrox in this game, I also think is really good. I think Renekton in general struggles against Aatrox, maybe not so much early, but I consider Aatrox to just be a better version of Renekton once you hit the late game team fights. I think that's really where you start to see a lot of positives come in from that pick. But when you look at JDG, some interesting picks on their side. Not only the first pick, Kalista, which is something we've seen kind of tossed up from a couple of different teams. We've seen some bans come out first rotation, and we've seen some teams just completely ignore her as a champion. Obviously, JDG prioritizes her heavy because they want to play for those early laning phases. They trust their players a lot, but the Vex being taken on B5. This is the first Vex, obviously, that we've seen at Worlds. We weren't even seeing Vex in previous patches. This is a really fun pick from Knight. Obviously, I'm a little bit biased as a Vex player myself, but I think she offers a ton towards this team comp. She's very good at being able to create a lot of pressure in the mid game and really start to take over once the map opens up. And if you want a clean answer to Taliyah, who wants to do the same thing on the other side, Vex is one of the few champions that not only can match what Taliyah does in terms of roaming and in terms of mobility, but can actually be a little bit more useful in some of those skirmishes. And so I think it's an interesting pick. I don't think it's something that I would feel as confident about if it wasn't Knight, in my opinion, the best player in the world, playing that champion. But you pair up the Vex with the Jarvan that we've seen be super successful, and, you know, we'll talk about Kanavi and how he played out this game. It just becomes so much easier to win this because of the amount of agency that you give yourself. And then it's not like BLG doesn't have agency. Obviously, this team does have a lot of opportunities to be able to make plays happen. And I don't even think that when you look at like the Kalista Renata lane, you're all that scared, mostly because of the Blitzcrank. I think it does really well into this matchup, but you do lack some of the more hard engage tools that you might look for. That being said, I like Red side and BLG's team fight a bit more, and so for JDG to just be able to outplay them in a lot of the team fights in this game, it just goes to show you the difference in these two teams. And I've been saying it a lot in this video, I know, but player diff is more important than draft diff at the end of the day. Player of the game for me is going to go to Kanavi in the jungle. We were kind of talking about him on day number 1 as the player who maybe looked the least good on JDG, as, you know, much as you can say that about a player on JDG with how much they dominate, but he really wasn't in that great of a spot in that BDS game on day number 1. He had lost the early game, really wasn't generating tempo, and it was like, oh, is Kanavi going to have another bad Worlds? Because he's had a couple of those in the past, and it was certainly something to keep an eye out for. But this was a complete, like, if you ever worried about that, I hope this game completely erased that thought from your mind. Because Kanavi was sensational in this. Not only was he creating pressure early on in the game, but those team fights, he was 1v9ing as Jarvan in these team fights. That's hard to do. It's really hard to create as much pressure as he did on a team comp with Vex and with Kalista and with Renekton to be the one that ends up dominating that game. That's really impressive. This is the Kanavi that we saw all year, winning early on by having basically perfect pathing, creating a lot of tempo in the early game, and then moving it in to the rest of the phase. Now, again, Ruler was also spectacular in this game. He's gonna get a lot of the credit for a lot of the good things that happened to JDG here, and rightfully so. Ruler is fantastic. He did make a couple of positioning mistakes, though, that, you know, we're gonna have to look out for. Vex is kind of the counter to Kalista, if you will, and it's interesting to see them kind of pick it up as something on blue side, but 369, in my opinion, was also really good this game on the Renekton. Don't take Bin playing really well on the other side of this map as 369 playing poorly. I think both 369 and Kanavi played a lot better than they did on day number 1, and everybody else definitely held up their end of the bargain. And then for BLG on the other side, you know, it's almost comical at this point, just the mental toll that this has to take out on Bilibili Gaming. I mean, they must have won 5 of the 20 games that these two teams have played over the course of this year across 7 different series. I mean, that's got to be completely emotionally shattering for some of these players. Not only that, but like I said, they did struggle at the end of the playoffs. Some of these players did struggle at the Asian Games when they were selected for Team China. It's just not really been that good of a run for Bilibili over the course of the last few weeks and the last few months or so. Now, that's not to say that they're not talented, but this was Bin playing pretty well on the Aatrox, definitely creating pressure and proving again that he probably is the best top laner in the world. He certainly proved that in that game against KT Rolster yesterday, but even in this one, he looked great. You know, 369 played well, but Bin played better, and I think if he had better teammates around him, this could have been a win for BLG, but everybody else was just not nearly as good. Elk took some major regression here today. He was playing super passive, super scared. It definitely feels like the mental toll on Elk is very palpable because we know how good he can be. He was great against KT Rolster as well, but it just feels like he doesn't have the same kind of confidence against JDG that he does against any other team in the world. Jun and Yagao have been kind of not very good at this tournament so far. I would argue that they were the weak pieces in game number 1, and they did not improve here in game number 2. Yagao was going to get my dud of the game. I saw a lot of people placing him in their top 20 list for players at Worlds. I was not one of them. He was an honorable mention for me, and even then, he was one that I was kind of hesitant to even put on the honorable mention list because I think his summer split was worse than people give him credit for. I think that, obviously, the regular season was good, but his playoffs were really bad. He got outshined a lot by both Scout and by night in the playoffs, and it really looked like it was going to be a weakness for this team, and that has kind of translated. The Taliyah was just not as good as the Vex, and I did not think I was going to say that on day 2 of the World Championships. June was not very active here. Kanavi was way better as a jungler. On couldn't create pressure on the Blitzcrank because every lane was already losing by the time that Blitz needed to generate any momentum. It just wasn't a very good game from BLG. Now, that being said, they're playing the best team in the world. They can bounce back tomorrow, and they're only going to the 1-1 part of the Swiss bracket. It's not like they're going to be, on death's door if they don't win tomorrow. They just need to get themselves back into that winner's side by beating a team that isn't JD Gaming, which is entirely possible. But the expectation for this team is probably not to just be good enough. They want to be a team that can contend to win the World Championships, and to do that, you at least have to be able to hang with JD Gaming, and they've just not been able to do that. JDG, for their credit on the other side, has been basically untouchable. They dominated day 1. They looked really good here on day 2 as well, and so you just feel really good about it. They've dominated every tournament. You're going to be picking them as favorites until they give you a reason to not do so, and at least through the first 2 games, that definitely has not happened yet. And finally, that means we can jump into our final game of the day here, game number 8. And it's another regional matchup. What'd you expect? 5 of the 8 today. The draw sucked. It is what it is, but we get an LCK matchup, our second LCK matchup of the day, as we see the number 3 seed from the LCK in KT Rolster taking on the number 4 seed in Dplus KIA. And KT Rolster is going to pick up the win. This is another one that I think I was just a little bit on. I think a lot of people were too high on DK going into this tournament. And specifically, I think a lot of people were just way too low on KT Rolster going into this tournament. This is the team that got first seed in the LCK in the regular season. Yes, they lost to T1 twice in the playoffs. It happens. They have a particularly bad matchup into T1, and quite frankly, T1 is a good team, or at least they were, in the LCK. That doesn't mean KT Rolster sucks. I've been seeing a ton of people, major analysts and very popular analysts, talk about KT not being a top 8 team at this tournament. I think that's insane. They are clearly top 8. I think that they are clearly top 5 at the current moment, or at least somewhere in the configuration of top 5. They ended up losing to Bilibili Gaming on day number 1, who is a great team and, is certainly not a devastating loss by any means. Their bot lane still played really good in that game. And now they go out and they just decimate DK, and I think that's exactly what you want to see. Now, DK is certainly not the team that I think a lot of people were hearing about in scrims going into this tournament, but still, it's damn one. Like, they're gonna play well at Worlds. It's Canyon and Showmaker, maybe the best mid-jungle duo ever, and so give some credit to KT Rolster. They've earned it at this point, especially with this nice win. Let's go ahead and talk about draft really quick. It's going to be crazy because I'm actually going to praise a draft that Orianna was drafted in, and it's because she wasn't B1, she wasn't R1, she wasn't blind picked in this game. Orianna has some very good matchups in the current meta, and one of them is Azir. I would argue this is Orianna's best matchup, specifically with the Sejuani as the jungle. I think Orianna is very much set up into a position to be incredibly strong in this game because she just is infinitely going to scale alongside the Azir. She's going to be just as strong in those team fights, and there are very few champions that are going to be able to do that against Azir. Not only that, but I think she actually creates a lot more pressure early if she plays up in this team composition. And so, like the Ori pick, I think that really sets KT's draft ahead in my opinion, but the Xayah Alistar is just straight up going to be stronger early than the Ziggs Leona, which is just a very weird bot lane to end up drafting if you are DK. I've kind of been pushing for AP bot laners, but this is probably not the circumstance to end up bringing that out in. Def did not play well in this game, and Kellen played even worse, which we will get to, but aiming and Lehens continue to look good. Really where DK has some advantages is the top lane, where again, because of the MR nerfs to Renekton on this patch, Jax is a much better matchup into Renekton now, and I do think Jax is strong into Renekton. Khan is a good enough player to be able to make that work, and I think Jarvan can create some, at least action in the early game if Canyon does want to try and, really bump up the tempo, but KT was just the better team, basically from moment one across the board in this one. Player of the game was quite difficult because I don't think there was any one particular player on KT that dominated, that really kind of carried the game for the team. I think this was much more of a team effort. I'm going to give it to aiming because it just feels like I don't praise aiming enough on this channel. It feels like I'm always talking about Lehens. I'm talking about BDD and Keen a lot. Even Cuz has gotten a lot for me over the course of this year. And I think I do get the reputation of kind of being an aiming hater, and I certainly don't think that I truly believe that. I think that I've just not talked about him enough because everybody else on this team is really noteworthy. But aiming was really good in game number 1, both him and Lehens. I think were very impactful in that first game, even in the loss to Bilibili, and I think they did it again here. The Xayah's a really strong pick. R1 Xayah just probably shouldn't be allowed. Again, I know we're kind of afraid of some of these more AP-oriented picks early on in the draft. I guess the Talia, the Rumble, things like that have to go, but Xayah should be priority on red side, in my opinion, to ban out in a lot of these games. Obviously, good for KT not banning it out because they got to pick it in first rotation, but Xayah's just too strong, especially if the Kai'Sa's not going to be on the priority list. There really isn't another AD carry that does the same thing in terms of damage towards the back half of the game, and Xayah's really good in a Kai'Sa, and so Xayah ends up being the premier ADC, and we've continuously seen that throughout not only today, but the entire tournament up until this point. Lehens had a really good Alistar game. What a big surprise. Lehens is still my #1 support in the world. I still think he's been really good at this tournament, even though KT is 1-1. The bot lane's really solid, but BDD stepping up and being as useful as he was on the Ori this game was a big turning point. Like I said, Ori's really strong with this draft configuration, and I do think that BDD executed on that really well. Cuz was solid. Keen played good enough, didn't really need to do a whole ton on the Renekton, even in that losing matchup, so I just think KT executed, right? That's really the kind of takeaway from this, is that if you execute better and if your draft gives you slight advantages and you make use of those, then you're probably going to win, and KT's definitely the better of these two teams. Then for DK on the other side, something's broken. I don't know what it is, but something is broken in this team configuration, specifically this bot lane. I don't know what happened, because they were the rock of DK in the playoffs and in the regional qualifiers where they made it to this tournament in the first place. Deft has been incredibly consistent this entire year. Kellen has actually looked really good for DK when he has played. They really struggled, you know, generating bot lane pressure when Bible was in and playing support, but when Kellen was reinserted back into the lineup, he was really good. He looked really good for this team, but it's just not working. Kellen has been, like, the worst player in the main stage so far. He has been miserable in both of the games that they have played. He's going to get done of the game again. I don't know what happened. I don't know if it's mental. I don't know if it's just, like, he's not comfortable playing the champions that are in meta, but he's pulling out things like Leona, which is a B tier at best engaged support in a meta where there are a lot of S tier engaged supports, and Rakan was unpicked this game. They opted into Leona. Like, I just don't get it. I don't understand. The Ziggs doesn't make a ton of sense in terms of your team configuration. You have so much AP damage already with the Azir, with the Jax. Even Jarvan's got a bit, and so it's just a very weird team construction, but Deft and Kellen being as poor as they were in this game is the reason that they lost, and if they're not going to be able to get better, if they're not going to be able to get more consistent as this tournament continues to go on, it's doomed for them. They're on death's door in terms of they're 0-2. Like, they've got to win tomorrow. That being said, Canyon and Showmaker are at least trying. I think Canyon tried to make plays. His scoreline looks worse than I think his performance was. He's not been sensational over the course of this year, but it's Canyon at Worlds. You have to expect he's going to be able to kick it into gear eventually, and Showmaker was solid this game. I think Kana was also relatively solid this game on the Jax. Just not too much he can do. The solo laners on the top side were fine, but bot lane was just too big of a hindrance to actually be able to play through and be able to win against. And so for DK, what do you need to fix? You just need to stabilize. There really is no other way to say it. This draft is fine. It's not perfect, but again, Ziggs Leona, you just got to switch it out for something a little bit more consistent. Maybe take the Xayah, I don't know, on B1. Like, that seems like a pretty good idea. Maybe don't blind pick Azir when Orianna is clearly the mid laner of choice for everybody else in the meta right now. I don't know. It just feels like there are so many questions around this DK team. But if Kellen plays like this the rest of the tournament, they're not going to win no matter what they draft. And then for KT on the other side, they look good. Again, I don't want to overrate this team, but I certainly think that people are underrating this team. K-Troll didn't even have them in his top 8. It's ridiculous. I don't understand the hate towards them. They dominated the regular season, and I think they looked okay enough in the playoffs. They were able to qualify in one series, quick and easy, against Hanwha Life in the regional qualifiers. They're a good team, and they have a lot going for them. Are they world-class? Definitely. Maybe not. They lost to Bilibili for a reason, but this is a team that you certainly can't look at and say that you can look over them as you move on to the next opponent. They're going to be a tough out for basically anybody at the tournament. Alright, but that is going to do it for my Worlds 2023 Day 2 overview and analysis video. We went over all 8 games. They were all best of ones, and that is not going to be the case as we preview now day number 3. Day 3 is when we start kicking into the best of 3s here in the Swiss stage, because by the end of tomorrow, we are going to know our first 2 teams that qualify for the bracket stage and our first 2 teams that are officially eliminated from the Swiss stage as well, with the 2-0 and the 0-2 sections. We'll also still have some best of ones sprinkled in, 4 of them with the 1-1s, but let's go ahead and preview these series very quickly. We're going to go from top to bottom here, so we'll start with the 2-0 series, and we get to start with a very interesting draw. I think the draws in general here for game number 3 are much better. These are some of the best that we could possibly ask for in terms of team matchups. And we kick that off with G2 taking on Gen.G. I mean, talk about a fun matchup between 2 teams that are 2-0. G2 has done nothing but prove me wrong over the course of this tournament. When I said that they weren't going to be a team that I expected to perform as highly as others expected, they have done nothing but beat teams that I said that they should be comparable to. Teams like Weibo, teams like Dplus KIA, they've been able to take them down, and they've looked good doing it. Now, it hasn't been perfect. They've thrown some Barons. The Weibo game was incredibly fun, but incredibly close, and they probably shouldn't have won it, but they are sitting here at 2-0. Gen.G, for their credit, have looked just as dominant as you would ask them to, but their strength of schedule has been significantly weaker than G2's. They took on GAM in Game 1, they took on T1, who seems to be struggling here in Game number 2, and while they did look good in both of those games, it's not exactly like they've been dominant. Now, I'm still going to pick Gen.G to win this game. You know, I bet against G2 once, I got fooled. I bet against G2 twice, I got fooled. I guess I'm the true fool for betting against them for the third time, but Gen.G is going to be the team that I end up picking here, and even though I've only gotten 2 games wrong in the entirety of the Swiss stage, and they've both been G2 wins, I guess I'm going to have to learn my lesson a third time for them to prove me wrong again. This is a best of 3, and I expect it to be fun, but Gen.G should be the better team here. And then the other 2-0 matchup is JD Gaming taking on LNG Esports, a rematch of the LPL Summer Finals, and again, it's just really hard to preview that JDG is going to lose a series or lose a game because they're that team. They're, in my opinion, maybe the most dominant team of all time. Certainly, if they continue to impress here at the World Championships, that's absolutely in the conversation. And as much as I like LNG, they've also had a really easy schedule getting here. Fnatic is pretty simple. Cloud9 is a pretty simple win. JD Gaming is a complete step up. And I like LNG. I really like their superstar trio, and Scout's been playing absolutely out of his mind, but JDG should be favorites, and I'm going to predict them. And then in the 1-1s, I think these are pretty interesting matchups. Energy versus Mad Lions, I think, is a fun one. Again, I'm a little bit higher on Mad just by the fact that I don't think that they only do well against EU teams. I think they just do well against teams that they are more talented than. Do I think that that's Energy? I don't know. I really don't. I think this is a really, really interesting series to try and predict, or a game to try to predict, because Mad could really struggle. They could come out and just shit the bed like they did against Cloud9, but I could also see them being the version of them that they were in the spring split and just kind of taking down an Energy team that sometimes lacks focus and sometimes lacks direction. I'm going to pick Energy very, very slightly just because of the form that they've had in the recent games, but again, if Mad wins this, I'm not going to be surprised. In fact, I'll probably be less surprised than a lot of other analysts will be. And then T1 versus Cloud9, fun matchup. Berserker facing his former org, his former, the team that he was on the Challengers team for. And it couldn't come at a better time for Cloud9. T1 is really struggling right now. That game against Gen.G was not good, and they very narrowly were able to take down Team Liquid, who is just worse than Cloud9. I'm not going to go as far as to say Cloud9 are favorites. T1 should be able to pick up the win in this game, and I would expect them to be able to pick up the win, but Owner has not been good, and Blabber is certainly good enough to be able to kind of abuse the form that Owner is in. Blabber is the better jungler in terms of current form, and it's going to be interesting to see if that continues, but I don't think it's going to matter too much. Faker into Eminus is super T1 favored, and I think that's the kind of matchup that ends up, moving T1 over the line, not to mention Zeus versus Fudge. And then you've got Weibo Gaming versus KT Rolster. Talk about a battle between two very explosive back-and-forth teams. I'm taking KT Rolster in this one. I know a lot of people are really on the Weibo hype train. They played G2 really tough, and they looked really good in their first game at Worlds against Energy, but KT's a team that I think everyone is sleeping on. I think they're a lot better than people give them credit for, and I think they should be able to take down an inconsistent Weibo team. But that being said, nobody determines whether Weibo wins or loses besides Weibo. They can beat any team in the world at their best. They can lose to any team at their worst. It's all going to be up to whether or not they perform. I'm going to predict KT because I don't predict them to perform, but it will be close. And then Bilibili versus Fnatic is the final 1-1 game here. Bilibili's the better team. This is probably the least interesting of the games at 1-1. BLG should be able to just kind of take care of business and put Fnatic back down into the lower part of the bracket. Fnatic has some interesting pieces, but I think pretty much all of their interesting ones match up really poorly into Bilibili in particular. Oscar Rinin is an interesting player, but Bin is the best top laner in the world. I think Razork and Humanoid have good chemistry, but Jun and Yagao are very good at neutralizing tempo in the early game, and that's what Fnatic needs to get off the ground. I just don't think it's a particularly good matchup for Fnatic, and BLG should be able to take it. And then our final 2 series in the O2, also best of 3s. One of these teams in each of them will be eliminated, starting, of course, Dplus KIA and Team BDS. 2 teams that are very much on different ends of the spectrum. DK should win this. If they don't win this, it's an absolute disaster class from them at Worlds this year, especially considering the fact that so many people talked about them as scrim gods coming into the tournament. If they can't beat BDS in a best of 3, I don't really know what to tell you. That would be a massive disappointment. Kellen has not been good, but somehow I think Crownie has been worse. It really is kind of a battle between who's going to underperform more in the bot lane there, but DK is better across the board. As much as I like Sheo and Nuke, it's Canyon and Showmaker, man. They should be able to pick up the win, and they should be favorites there. And then Team Liquid taking on GAM. I think this is closer than people give them credit for. I think that there's a real world in which GAM could pick up a win here. I think this is probably the team in the main stage that GAM could most likely beat, maybe outside of BDS, but TL should take it. They're a major region team facing a minor region team. You would have to imagine that they're going to be better. I just don't trust their ability to close out games, really, at all. They've not been able to do that domestically, and they've already shown an inability to do that here at Worlds. And so if they're not able to do that against GAM, like, GAM has good players. Kati is a really strong player. KIA is a really strong player. These are, you know, definitely players that can go up against TL's talent and be relatively neutral. It's just going to be about, you know, the full effort. Pioshik should be the best player in this series. Core JJ should be the second best player in this series, and so Team Liquid, just purely based on skill, should be able to take this. But I don't think it's quite as clear-cut as maybe it's made out to be, but that's gonna do it. Those are the previews for day number 3. If you enjoyed the video, it really would mean a lot to me if you left a like on it. It really does mean a lot. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content. Helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're covering Worlds every single day on this channel that there are games. We're gonna be covering day 3, and then, of course, day 4 is coming up right after that, and so you know, we're really rocking and rolling. We're getting really close to determining the teams that are going to be in the bracket stage of Worlds, getting close to determining who our top 8 is going to be. If you want to get coverage on every single game, including the best of 3s that happen over the course of this tournament, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. Hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.